I'm Ken Stroop. I'm the Chief of Staff at the UVA Center for Politics. Before we get started this morning, I want to make you aware of one upcoming collateral program offering that is available to anyone around the country and around the world. For the Kennedy Half Century, Professor Sabato will be teaching a course on Coursera. It is a 4-week course. You can find it on Coursera.org. If you just look for either Sabato or Kennedy, that's Coursera.org. It's a massive open online course that will begin next Monday. You can also find it on the iTunes U platform, again, by looking for either Sabato or Kennedy. And before we get started this morning, we're going to run just the opening trailer of the massive open online course so you have a feel for what the material and the content of that course looks like. So let's roll that tape, please.
Air Force One is on final approach now. Punch on the ground.
The morning rain clouds over Dallas were gone, but the clouds over a nation were just beginning to form. The cameras caught Mrs. Kennedy stepping off the plane first. As they came down the plane stairway, a cheer went up from the crowd of spectators. They had been waiting all morning to catch a glimpse of the world's most famous couple. Anyone with a pistol could have fired at them. The agents were relieved when the Kennedys finally climbed into the back seat of their convertible. Everyone in Dallas knew the precise details of the president's route. It had been printed in the newspapers and discussed on local television during the week.
Pretty good crowd there. Big crowd, yes.
The motorcade traveled along Main Street and then turned right onto Houston. Looming directly ahead was the nondescript Texas School Book Depository. Seconds later, the motorcade slowed for an unusual hairpin left turn onto Elm Street. We want a time tunnel to 1963 so we can shout, "Go back to Air Force One." But the celluloid figures can't hear a warning. The early reports were confusing. It was difficult to separate fact from rumor. And then the news came.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
In the blink of an eye, America had changed forever. The youngest elected chief executive in U.S. history became the youngest to die. Political power is created in many ways: winning an election, facing down an enemy, or skillfully riding the waves of popular opinion. But lasting power is accorded to only a handful of presidents, especially after their death. There is no doubt that John Kennedy is one of the few. The tragedy overwhelmed the public's senses and raised a host of painful questions. Why did it happen? How could it happen? November 22, 1963 was so powerful a moment in the national psyche that in the 50 years since the assassination, Democratic and Republican presidents alike have used Kennedy's words and actions in an effort to craft their own political images. Why does Kennedy's influence persist, and will it continue? We'll address these questions and much more as we explore the Kennedy Half Century.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you the author of the Kennedy Half Century and the director of the Center for Politics, and hopefully your professor when you enroll in the Kennedy Half Century massive open online course, Professor Larry Sabato.
Ken, thank you very, very much, and thank you for the tremendous job that you've done in these past few years. It's been a 5-year project in putting together the pieces of our Kennedy project. There are actually 5 pieces, and I'll tell you what they are. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. Some of you are here voluntarily, and then there are the students. But also the ones who are not my students, you're going to suffer the way my students do regularly with a lecture. So I just want to warn you in advance, if you didn't get enough coffee, feel free to grab some in the back. Well, in any event, this is the official release of my new book, The Kennedy Half Century, The Presidency, Assassination, and Lasting Legacy of John F. Kennedy. Today I'm going to conjure up a time when government actually worked. And as a country, we did big things. Both parties, of course, fussed and fought a lot, but ultimately Democrats and Republicans pulled together when the national interest was clear. Bipartisanship was often very real. I'm sure you're drawing the same contrast that I am with what's going on in another place in this town. John F. Kennedy was a part of that era. This book about him is a 5-year study and is published by Bloomsbury. I have a large contingent of staff and student interns with me today from the University of Virginia Center for Politics, and I dare not start listing names because that would kill our hour together. But all are acknowledged individually in the book, and I thank them enthusiastically but collectively for the moment, and I know they will all understand. This was an expensive project, and we were fortunate to have financial support from many donors. Two of those groups of donors are in the audience. First, an old friend, Dan Alcorn, and then a delegation representing McGuire Woods Consulting and McGuire Woods Law Firm, and I particularly want to salute my dear friend and decades ago, a former student, Frank Atkinson. Thank you, Frank, and thank you to others who may be here representing McGuire Woods. I also have several guests from Dallas here with us. They were in Charlottesville last night for a panel sponsored by the Center for Politics, and they did a fantastic job. Everyone enjoyed it, and we had a large crowd despite this being a student break, fall break. Former Dallas Sheriff Jim Bowles, who was the police dispatcher on duty at police headquarters on November 22nd, 1963. Wesley Buell Frazier, the Texas School Book Depository employee who drove Lee Harvey Oswald to work on November 22nd, 1963, and saw the package of curtain rods that he was carrying. I'm not sure Sid Davis is with us right now, but Sid he was with us last night. He's the AP reporter in Dallas on November 22nd who witnessed LBJ swearing in. He's prominent in the picture. He's just to the back and to the right of Jackie Kennedy in that famous photo. And Gail Nix Jackson, whose grandfather, Orville Nix, took the famous film of the assassination on the opposite side of Dealey Plaza from Abraham Zapruder. By the way, our guests here disagree on the whodunit of the assassination, and as such, they well represent the contrary opinions that still roil the waters in the United States and elsewhere. As they revealed last night, they also have their own fascinating stories and subplots about that day in Dallas, and they can stay for a while afterwards and answer your questions and discuss those subplots with you. Now, we're in the season of 50th year commemorations of the assassination of President Kennedy. We decided we could best make a contribution by clarifying as much as we could about November 22nd, 1963. But even more important, by examining the 50 years since November 22nd, 1963, since that tragic day in Dallas, to answer the following question. What impact has President Kennedy had on his 9 White House successors and on the American public over generations? In other words, for a president taken so young and before he had a chance to create a full legacy, has there been life and legacy after death? We at the UVA Center for Politics have tackled these key questions in 5 ways. First, the Kennedy Half Century book being rolled out today. Ken just discussed with you our MOOC, our massive open online course, and I always say 2 things. It's free, because that's the first thing people ask, and no, you don't have to take any tests. That's the second question that people ask. So we hope that you'll take a look at that. We also have an app coming up, a special app that I'm going to describe later, and that's going to be rolled out next week. And I think you'll be very interested in this app. And we have a new website, the KennedyHalfCentury.com, and also a PBS documentary, which will be viewed first at the end of October in certain cities and then will be nationwide throughout November. Now, surely few people in 1963 or 1964, and some of our guests here well remember that time, few people in 63 or 64 thought we would still be arguing about the basics of the Kennedy assassination 50 years later. But we are, and it's going to continue. Even with the 2017 release of all documents, I'll talk about that too, if it actually happens in full, the debate about November 22nd will likely never end. It isn't just the obvious notion, so often cited, that people are unwilling to accept that the most powerful person on earth could be killed by an inconsequential individual, and thus they seek balance by searching for a wider conspiracy. It's also that the process of investigating the crime of the century was so flawed and corrupted from the very beginning that it makes it difficult or impossible to accept the conclusions issued from on high. The result is obvious. A half century later, many of the assassination fundamentals are too disputed for a resolution because too many leads were not followed when the trail was hot, and too many plausible and implausible theories have been put forward and have sizable followings. I should show you my Twitter feed and my emails, but I won't because some of you would be easily offended. Doubts about the single gunman explanation are deeply ingrained in the American public and indeed much of the world's people. So much so that I think those doubts will persist over the generations. Moreover, so many pieces of the puzzle remain in dispute or unresolved that any other author who tells you in this special anniversary season that they have all the answers, that they figured everything out, that the murder of President Kennedy is a closed case, is willfully ignoring many established facts and demonstrating great hubris. The murder of President Kennedy has become a Rorschach test about one's views of the government's credibility. And at least in terms of honest, full, and timely disclosure, the government, the American government, has failed the test miserably over the last 50 years. It's an easy prediction that 100 years from now, our descendants will be watching documentaries about contrary assassination theories and debating them at length, just as we now do with the Lincoln assassination. I need to move quickly through complicated matters. It's impossible to summarize a 600-page book in the time that we have available. And I want to stress again that most of the Kennedy half century is about President Kennedy's career and how his presidential legacy has influenced and enabled 9 successors in the White House. It's wrong to focus solely on the president's tragic death without an emphasis on his impactful life. But unavoidably, with the 50th anniversary of November 22nd just weeks away, we must start with Dallas. Now, first, I make an extended argument in the book that President Kennedy's assassination may have been nearly inevitable. Perhaps because of the difference in ages, President Eisenhower appears to have traveled less and attracted far smaller crowds in most circumstances. And Little Rock aside, he served in the domestically more quiescent 50s. I remember, I grew up then. JFK and his times were the opposite and were destined to become more so as the 60s wore on. It's no secret that John Kennedy attracted not just passionate support, but deep hatred from a variety of individuals and groups with the motive, means, and opportunity to kill him as president. But the main factor in his vulnerability to violence was a stunning lack of security in many situations. He was relatively unprotected from armed assassins in crowds and motorcades at home and abroad in ways that are absolutely unthinkable today. Why the difference? There was a strange belief back then that tragedy couldn't and wouldn't happen in America to a popular president, even though Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley had already fallen to assassins' bullets, and serious attacks were mounted or planned against Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover, people have forgotten about that one, Franklin Roosevelt as president-elect, and Harry Truman, the Puerto Rican nationalist, just in the half century preceding JFK. I want you to take a look at this short presentation of still photos and video clips. We could have done a half hour of this, but we wanted to give you a sense of just how unprotected the president was. It's a small sampling of the dozens of dangerous situations that we found just in a video and photo search during the president's campaign and White House tenure. In almost all cases, at home and abroad, the crowds were unscreened. People were not kept from enveloping him, and I mean just totally enveloping the President of the United States with very little security there beside him, at times nearly crushing the President. Windows in buildings were rarely closed as he passed by, in part because air conditioning was very rare in 1963. And President Kennedy often stood up in an open car at home and abroad as president, making him an even easier target than he was in Dallas when he was sitting and only part of his torso was exposed. Let me show this video if we could. President Kennedy had had more than his share of assassination threats since the 1960 election. In fact, there was a very serious one that could easily have succeeded. The full-page ad in the Dallas Morning News accused the president of supporting communists and using the Justice Department to silence critics. Anyone with a pistol could have fired through or over the fence at point-blank range. And thanks to our friends at Paladin Productions who work with us on our video presentations. They do a tremendous job. In Dallas on November 22nd, with about 200,000 people lining a route with hundreds of open windows over 9.5 miles, believe it or not, there were just 12 Secret Service agents in the motorcade with JFK, none riding on the sideboards of the limo, which even Harry Truman had had. Now, there's a dispute about whether he ordered them off or not. I'm not getting into that. In those times, the agents were overworked and the agency was underfunded. There had already been warnings just 4 days before the 1960 election in an incident we found that's long forgotten. 2 separate men carrying firearms had been arrested in Chicago trying to follow then-candidate Kennedy into a rally. And in December 1960, a man with a car loaded with dynamite had come very, very close to achieving his objective, killing the president-elect. Other plots in Chicago and Miami during his presidency, in fact in 1963, have been disclosed since. We have no idea how many others there might have been. Given the thinnest of thin blue lines protecting John F. Kennedy, and considering the social turmoil that was unfolding in the 60s, it would have been a major miracle if JFK had gotten through 2 terms without 1 or more assassination attempts. But the one that succeeded in Dallas still obsesses and mesmerizes us. We're all familiar with the basics, and I don't have time today to cover all the categories of serious suspects in the president's murder, though I do so in the Kennedy half century. It takes a lot of pages to get through the usual suspects in this case. In the minutes available to us, I'm just going to concentrate on 2 of the dozens of questions I address in the book. The first question is, what did the Warren Commission get right and what did they do wrong? And second, what about the second governmental investigation, the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s? They reinvestigated the murder of President Kennedy. Did they do any better than the Warren Commission? Well, I believe that my Kennedy half-century team, which included the internationally renowned firm Sonalist for part of the study, has shown that both commissions were seriously flawed. In our view, the Warren Commission was probably right about Lee Harvey Oswald and his shots from the Texas School Book Depository. But the Warren report did not conclusively disprove the possibility of a second gunman or other kinds of conspiracy, including collusion with Oswald. And the Warren investigation itself was seriously defective in fundamental ways. Second, my team has proven, as I'll explain, and as you'll see, beyond a shadow of a doubt, for the first time, because an earlier report suggested this but couldn't prove it, said more research was necessary. We've done the research. We have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt for the first time that the main conclusion of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, that a Dallas police recording called a Dictabelt, that Mr. Bowles is well familiar with, shows 4 shots, not 3, which means a conspiracy. Oswald had time to fire only 3 shots. 4 shots, they claimed, were on this recording, fired in Dealey Plaza. That commission conclusion is absolutely wrong. The odd tale of the Warren Commission begins with the establishment of a verdict first, investigation later. Within 24 hours, President Johnson, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and others had simply decided, without an investigation, that Lee Oswald was the lone gunman. No one could have known all the facts that quickly. We were in the midst of a hot Cold War, and dissent was minimized out of a fear that Americans would demand a retaliatory strike if fingers pointed at Cuba or Russia or others. Johnson wanted the commission's report out before the peak of 1964's election season. There was a political structure in the schedule. Key agencies that should have helped the Warren Commission reach its conclusions, especially the FBI and the CIA, destroyed or hid evidence, never told the commission about their ties with mafia leaders, never told the commission about attempts on the life of Fidel Castro, never told the commission that they knew more about Oswald than they ever let on. They told the commission none of this. They also coached some witnesses and tried to get others to change their testimony, including Mr. Frazier over here at the end, and he can tell you his story after this is over. They wanted everyone to fit their preferred conclusions. They also failed to interview other key witnesses that 48, 49, 50 years later I've interviewed, who were right there in Dealey Plaza taking key photos, taking key videos with strong opinions about what happened. They never got interviewed, and they themselves were amazed. Some put themselves out there available for for an interview were never brought in because the Warren Commission was in a rush. It's perfectly obvious now what was going on. When there were pieces that didn't fit the Warren Commission's theory of November 22nd, the panel just disregarded them. Again, Mr. Frazier can give you a good example, but I'm going to focus on one that's always disturbed me. Dallas police, who were familiar with Secret Service credentials, reported that they encountered Secret Service agents with the proper credentials on and behind the grassy knoll immediately after President Kennedy was shot, within a minute after the shooting. There's just one problem. All agents were accounted for during that time period, every single agent. The Warren Commission and the Secret Service accounted for every single one. No agent returned to Dealey Plaza until at least 20 minutes after the assassination. So who were these people with phony Secret Service credentials? The Warren Commission simply declared the police were mistaken. I mentioned quite a number of these ill-fitting puzzle pieces in the Kennedy half century. They would trouble any open-minded individual examining the murder of President Kennedy. Many of these conundrums appear to have some connection to the CIA. By no means am I anti-CIA. I respect the agency. They're absolutely essential, particularly in these times. And in fact, I've had very good students go to work for them. But in studying this subject, I can see that one consistency linking the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations is the degree to which the CIA, or the one existing at that time, misled both government groups investigating the assassination. I've wondered, was the CIA simply trying, as the FBI did, to cover its tracks because it missed Oswald's potential to be an assassin? Or is there a more sinister explanation? I personally believe it is the former, but the CIA's repeated intentional deceptions of the government's official investigations of the assassination deter anyone from reaching a final conclusion. Let's see what is in the unreleased CIA documents about President Kennedy's murder. This is no small collection. Reputable groups and individuals have estimated the total number of unreleased CIA papers about November 22nd to be anywhere from 1,171 documents to 50,000 pages. OMB Watch has even claimed there may well be over 1 million CIA records that have something to do with President Kennedy's assassination. No one can write the definitive book on this subject without examining those documents. I have much more in the Kennedy half century, but my basic conclusion is this. The many inadequacies of the Warren Commission have condemned us as a nation to 50 years of unending suspicions and cynicism. This does not mean the Warren Commission was necessarily wrong in its basic conclusions. As I mentioned earlier, the more I've studied this, the more I believe the evidence is convincing that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor window of the school book depository and killed President Kennedy and wounded Governor Connally, much as the commission described it. But it is not clear beyond question that no one else was involved, nor did the commission have all the key facts they needed to properly evaluate whether Oswald was encouraged to undertake the assassination or whether another gunman was behind the fence on the grassy knoll. He didn't have to take a shot, or if he did, the shot could have missed. Nor did they have critical intelligence information that could have encouraged them to investigate more thoroughly the mafia and the anti-Castro Cubans. A poor process by the Warren Commission, a rush job, and hidden agendas made the commission's report unconvincing to tens of millions then and now. The additional tragedy was heaped on top of the assassination itself, that the American people wanted the full truth and were willing to pay whatever was necessary and wait as long as necessary to get the answers. Instead, the Warren Commission's shortcuts and hidden deceptions have led to a half century of second guessing and a cavernous credibility gap. And we'll show you the polling data a little bit later. We have the great pollster Jeff Guerin, who worked with us along with Peter Hart on the special poll that we did for this book. Now, let's talk about the House Committee, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Did they do any better in the 1970s? Certainly, they were sincerely determined to take more testimony than the Warren Commission ever did and to uncover evidence ignored by the Warren Commission. And in the end, they blew up the basic conclusion of the Warren Report. You will recall that in 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations decided that President Kennedy was killed as the result of a conspiracy. And they did so based largely on a Dictabelt recording made at police headquarters, supervised by Mr. Bowles right over there, because they believed a policeman in the motorcade near the president's limo had a stuck microphone on his motorcycle, and thus, through the primitive technology available at the police headquarters, recorded the gunshots in Dealey Plaza as they occurred. Elaborate analysis by that committee of the Dictabelt found 4 gunshots to a probability, they said, of 95%. While a subsequent National Academy of Sciences study questioned the committee's conclusions, the NAS admitted that serious questions remained and that more and better research was needed before conclusions could be drawn. Then a different 2002 study confirmed the House Select Committee on Assassination finding and increased the probability of 4 shots to 96%. Since just about everyone agrees that Oswald could only have fired 3 shots in the approximately 8 seconds of gunfire, 4 shots, just about everybody agrees, equals a second gunman and thus a conspiracy. By the way, for those of you not familiar with it, what we call the Dictabelt is actually a collection of belts that recorded all police communications on 2 channels on November 22nd from 9:44 a.m., well before Air Force One landed, until 3:57 p.m. on that terrible day, long after Air Force One and Two had left Dallas. Our transcript of the day's chatter, which is akin to listening to a modern police scanner, is more complete than any ever compiled due to the sound techniques that we employed. It totals more than 30,000 words and includes comments by dozens of police personnel and officers stationed at key locations around Dallas all day long. All the audio and transcripts will be released next week as a mobile app available to anyone for download. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Now, either the House Select Committee on Assassinations was correct when they asserted that there were too many shots to have been fired just by Oswald with his bolt-action rifle in the shooting sequence on the Zapruder film, or the House Select Committee on Assassinations was wrong when it claimed the Dictabelt recording was the long-sought proof of conspiracy. 50 years ago this month, President Kennedy, shortly before his assassination, said at the National Academy of Sciences, quote, "Science is the most powerful means we have for the unification of knowledge," unquote. To the extent possible, in producing the Kennedy half-century, we've employed the scientific method to this part of the assassination riddle. As a result, the mystery that has surrounded those Dictabelts for decades can now be solved, and their real value to the puzzle of November 22nd will be revealed here for the first time. New painstaking and technologically advanced audio research conducted for this book on all the Dallas police recordings of the Kennedy assassination, which were made available to us after considerable prodding by the National Archives, took a while. Our study conclusively proves that the Dallas police motorcycle with the stuck microphone was not even traveling as part of the presidential motorcade at the time the shots were fired at President Kennedy. Thus, the 1979 conclusion by the House Select Committee on Assassinations is simply wrong. Not only does the Dictabelt not prove the committee's assertion about a shot from the grassy knoll, we find no evidence at all on the Dictabelt of gunfire, and thus it cannot be used to prove either that Oswald was the lone gunman or that there was more than one shooter in Dealey Plaza. Previous scientific studies of the Dictabelt have either been fundamentally flawed because of a belief that the motorcycle was an integral part of the presidential motorcade, traveling close to the president's limousine, or because of their incorrect or non-existent identification of the officer with the stuck microphone. Additionally, these studies have incorrectly interpreted certain sounds on the Dictabelt as being gunshots. Our research demonstrates that the police officer with the open microphone was traveling at a high rate of speed at the very time the slow-moving presidential motorcade progressed through the streets of downtown Dallas. The officer was well past the Dealey Plaza site. He was in the vicinity of the Trade Mart, over 2 miles from Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination. Furthermore, following the shooting, the presidential limousine carrying the dying president approached and then rushed by this officer and his motorcycle on its way to Parkland Hospital. The Doppler effect with the new sound techniques is very, very clear to all. At that moment, when the limousine passed and the sirens were screaming, the motorcycle was parked and idling. The sounds of the presidential entourage gunning toward Parkland are unmistakable, and they passed the stationary motorcycle within sight of the officer. There were no other siren-equipped emergency vehicles of any type operating in Dallas at this critical moment. In addition, we believe we have been able to identify the specific officer with the stuck microphone, as well as the source of the, quote, impulses that the House Select Committee on Assassinations wrongly identified as gunshots. And those findings are in the book. Now that we know the location of the stuck microphone, something else is obvious. Given the distance of the open microphone from Dealey Plaza, 2.25 miles away at the time of the assassination, it is unlikely in the extreme that gunshots will ever be detected on this Dictabelt recording, no matter how sophisticated sound analysis becomes in the future. Keep in mind that the motorcycle was loudly running at high speed at the time the shots were fired. The cycle's microphone quality was primitive, on par with a telephone receiver, and that a blunt stylus was simply recording sound impressions on a waxed plastic belt back at police headquarters. This was truly primitive, but it was advanced for the time, but primitive in today's terms. Here's the conclusion. Therefore, the long hoped for Rosetta Stone of the Kennedy assassination is nothing of the sort. And the much publicized conclusion of proven conspiracy by the 1979 House Select Committee on Assassinations is demonstrably wrong. Now, let me stress again, we've not necessarily disproven the idea of a second shooter in Dealey Plaza, but we've certainly blown apart forever the conclusion of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And we have the detailed report here, and I do mean detailed. I learned more about sound analysis than I've ever known or ever wanted to know. And we were working with them at times up to 6 hours a day on this for months to make this understandable. It's a very detailed report, and it's available to press members now and to anyone on this app, which will be released later on. Now, we also know for sure the Dictabelts cannot confirm or deny the existence of a second gunman. Those who remember the House Select Committee on Assassinations remembers the very able director, Robert Blakey, very good guy. He stated that, quote, if it could be proved that no motorcycle was in the predicted location in the motorcade at the time of the shots, then serious doubt would be raised about the reliability of the committee's acoustics project, unquote. That's precisely what we've proven, precisely. Now, let's talk about what the Dictabelt is good for. So, are the Dictabelt recordings of any use? While the Dictabelt is not the time tunnel to ultimate truth about the source of the Dealey Plaza shots that it was once heralded as being, the recordings are invaluable nonetheless, and we all owe a debt of gratitude to Mr. Bowles there because he helped to preserve them for many, many years. What I've learned in writing the Kennedy half century is that the Dictabelt recordings are dramatic living history. They're a kind of black box for the crash that occurred on November 22nd, 1963. They not only give us new insights into a day that changed America, but collectively they serve as a police soundtrack that can supplement, though not precisely match, the silent films taken on the motorcade route. In the morning, there are standard police communications about a presidential visit, from the arrival of Air Force One at Love Field to the difficulties of holding back enthusiastic crowds pressing to get a better view of the Kennedys. Suddenly, routine conversation ends. The police work turns chaotic. Sheriff Decker issues an order to investigate the area behind the grassy knoll. He says, "Have my office move all men available into the railroad yard in an effort to determine what happened in there and hold everything secure until homicide and other investigators should get there," unquote. There's a discussion about victims remaining in Dealey Plaza, the possible shooting of a Secret Service agent, which of course didn't happen, and an early description of a suspect. Officers also reported the very contradictory claims of many witnesses about the source of the gunshots. Officers at the Trade Mart ask what they can do to tell the hundreds of people assembled for a speech President Kennedy would never deliver. The dispatcher asks Officer 1, who was Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry, who was at Parkland with the presidential entourage and was well aware of the fatal nature of the wounds. He was asked, "Is the president going to appear at the Trade Mart?" The sad, sparse answer from Chief Curry, "It's very doubtful. I feel reasonably sure that he will not." There are also Dictabelt references to a series of post-assassination events, from the shooting of Officer Tippit to the arrest of Lee Oswald to the police transporting of LBJ, Jackie Kennedy, and JFK's body back to Air Force One. From tiny sound impressions made on crude recording devices on that long ago day, the shock and horror of November 22nd comes to life again, and a listener cannot help but to be mesmerized. I hope you will all listen to the mobile app when it's released next week. Here is just a tiny sampling of the hours of recordings we've been able to restore and transcribe. Let's see this video again, Paladin Productions.
Air Force One is turning to its final approach. Are we going to have any more men on Main Street than what we now have assigned? We've got some pretty large crowds down here and very few officers. Crossing downtown Dallas now. Pretty good crowd there. Big crowd, yes. Looks like the president's been hit. Have people stand by. 10-4 Parkland has been notified. Go to the hospital. Parkland Hospital, have them stand by. Have the station 5 to move all men available out of my department back into the railroad yards there in an effort to try to determine if what and when happened down there and hold everything secure until the homicide and other investigators can get there. The president's head was practically blown off. There's a possibility that 6 or 7 more people may have been shot. On the 5th floor of this bookstore company down here, we found empty rifle holes, and looked like the man had been there for some time. Can you obtain from one if the president is going to appear at the Trade Mart? Don't know, but I feel reasonably sure that he will not. We request information as to extent of injuries to the president, and also if the governor was hit. The governor was hit, but we do not have any information as to extent of injury. Notify 1 that we have an officer involved in a shooting at 10th and Patton. We don't know the extent of it yet. Like a 30-30 or some type of a Winchester. Or was a rifle? A rifle, yes. Attention all squads, the suspect from Elman, Houston is reported to be an unknown white male about 30, slender build, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 165 pounds, armed with what is thought to be a 30-30 rifle No further description at this time or information. The officer involved in the shooting, which is Officer J.D. Tippett, we believe, was pronounced DOA at Methodist 128. Any report on the condition of the President and the Governor? Well, I understand the President's dead and the Governor don't know about him.
We have information that a suspect just went in the Texas theater on West Jefferson. 10-4. Supposed to be hiding in the balcony. They had a shooting of a police officer, which was DOA at Methodist. The suspect has been apprehended at Texas Theater and route to station.
10-4, thank you. We'll have information now. Judge Sarah Hughes is leaving Parkland en route to Love Field to swear President Johnson in. Both Air Force 1 and 2 are gone now. The only thing we have left is the news plane. We don't need anything else out here. We don't need an ambulance or anything. It's just a matter of cleaning up now.
That's just a tiny taste of the 30,000 words in transcript and audio that we will have on the app for those of you who are interested. And we also have some additional lines we haven't released today and will at the time that the app is rolled out in about a week's time. I think you'll find some of those new lines kind of interesting. Now, there are other tangible items besides the dictabelts. Those whose minds remain open about November 22nd should keep an eye on the calendar, the year 2017 in particular. The 1992 Records Act requires that all remaining documents about the Kennedy assassination must be released by October 26, 2017. They could be released earlier, even today, but we're talking about government bureaucracy, and it's currently closed. Many thousands of documents and pages remain hidden, and most likely those of highest sensitivity will be held until the last moment. The next president will be the one to rule on requests from the CIA and other agencies that documents be withheld or redacted or not. Under the law, the president can do so only if there is, quote, identifiable harm to military, defense, intelligence operations, or conduct of foreign relations, and the identifiable harm is of such gravity that it outweighs the public interest in disclosure. Surely, after what will have been 54 years, considering virtually all the individuals discussed in the documents will have been long dead, and the worlds of intelligence gathering and foreign policy have dramatically changed in that time, there cannot be credible objection to the release of all of the remaining documents, with no redactions or at least the severe minimization of redaction. We, the people, paid for these documents and all the employees and agencies that produced them. In a case of such importance and continuing controversy, we should have the opportunity to examine them in our lifetimes. It would be worth asking all the 2016 presidential candidates in both parties whether they would agree to maximum full disclosure in this matter. All right, now I'm going to turn to President Kennedy's legacy, a kind of life after death. How did his words and deeds influence his 9 White House successors? How did these presidents use JFK's words and deeds to further their own programs and agendas? What I've tried to do in about 150 pages of this 600-page book is to write a brief history of the last 50 years through the prism of John F. Kennedy. The enterprise was enlightening, at least to me, and I learned a good deal about every leader from Johnson to Obama. I only have time to mention one example for each president, but the Kennedy half-century contains dozens of cases you might find interesting. For Lyndon Johnson, I'll leave aside the Civil Rights Act in Vietnam for the moment, though I discuss them extensively in the book. It's hard to avoid Vietnam. My favorite example for Lyndon Johnson is the war on poverty. Right before JFK left for Dallas, an aide, Walter Heller, met with Kennedy and proposed a program to combat poverty. Kennedy would sign off only on a possible pilot program in a few cities. He wanted no big spending, budget-busting welfare subsidies. He was really a fiscal conservative in the way that we conceive of it today. Heller met with LBJ the day after the assassination to tell him what JFK had said. Johnson, with his hardscrabble background, loved the idea and immediately countermanded Kennedy's cautious approach. Quote, "That's my kind of program. It's a people's program," said Johnson. "Go ahead, give it the highest priority. Push ahead full tilt." The lesson here is, and I found it again and again, Johnson cited John Kennedy as the source of almost every major thing he did. But the truth is, it was the new president's thinking that drove policy. And by the way, you can apply that to Vietnam. One other note, there's a cottage industry this year fingering Lyndon Johnson as a participant in or having foreknowledge of the Kennedy assassination. I'll be the last person to say that any conclusion is definitive, but I just don't buy the theory, and I explain why in the book. Not that I don't think he was thrilled to become president, but we're talking about murdering the president here. What about Nixon? It's little known, but days into the administration, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman proposed that Nixon reinvestigate November 22nd. The reason's clear. Even at that time, the Warren Commission report was already deeply unpopular. And it was following yet another Kennedy assassination, that of Robert Kennedy's. Now, Nixon refused, though he later admitted to the FBI's Mark Felt, who of course was Deep Throat, Woodward and Bernstein's Deep Throat, that the Warren Commission was inadequate, said Nixon. Nevertheless, despite his lingering jealousies and anger about the 1960 election, which Nixon believed was stolen, he used JFK extensively in defending his own Vietnam policies and Watergate revelations about his eavesdropping on political foes. Gerald Ford, ironically, the staunchest defender of the Warren Commission report, and I personally talked to him twice about it, and adamant is the appropriate adjective. He insisted that it was completely accurate, and, you know, may he rest in peace. He actually presided over 3 reinvestigations of parts of the Warren Report: the Rockefeller Commission, the Frank Church Senate Committee, and the beginnings of the House Select Committee on Assassination. And of course, Ford became the first president since JFK to be the target of assassination, though fortunately he survived both of the attempts by the very nutty Lynette Squeaky Fromm and Sarah Jane Moore. Jimmy Carter, we had a lot of fun here. In 1976, Carter used JFK and Catholicism as a shield against attacks on his own, Carter's, evangelical faith. But I've identified some long-forgotten comments that Carter made in 1976 about John Kennedy, as well as Ted Kennedy, that I contend in the book started the Carter-Ted Kennedy feud that helped to produce Carter's 1980 defeat for re-election. President Carter gave me a wonderful and lengthy interview, and I appreciated it very much. And it was obvious that time hasn't healed those wounds. Among other things, and this was very recent, Carter called Ted Kennedy a big pain in the ass and said Kennedy thought he was entitled to the presidency because of what had happened to JFK and RFK. I have a lot more of the interview in the book. Ronald Reagan. Of all the presidents, I was most surprised by what I learned about the relationship between Reagan and the Kennedys. Of course, Reagan backed Nixon in 1960. He was a severe critic of JFK's presidency. Some in Reagan's family actually believed that Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, pressured General Electric into firing Reagan as host of GE Theater. Some of us actually remember that show. But no president except LBJ used JFK's words and record more skillfully to help his own cause than Ronald Reagan. I cite dozens of cases where Reagan talked directly to blue-collar Reagan Democrats, and thus the Democratic House of Representatives, to get his across-the-board tax cuts passed, as well as to win support for his battles against the evil empire of communism. Reagan's use of JFK is a reminder, really, about how conservative President Kennedy was on economics and foreign policy. George H.W. Bush was also an interesting case, perhaps because of Vice President Dan "You're No Jack Kennedy" Quayle. Bush 41 was hesitant about quoting John F. Kennedy. But even though as a former director of the CIA, he wasn't thrilled about the Assassination Records and Collection Act, he signed it into law 2 weeks before the 1992 election. That act, which was a direct result, and you have to give him credit whether you agree with the film or not, direct result of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, was and will prove to be again very significant. And know what you have read on the internet about the senior Bush having a role in the Kennedy assassination, or even being there, as a photo with some guy that looks kind of like George H.W. Bush. It is complete malarkey, as I explain in the book. Bill Clinton, except for the sons of Presidents John Adams and George H.W. Bush, we've never had a president who so idolized a predecessor as Clinton did JFK. And Clinton copied many of JFK's policies and behaviors, good and bad. Clinton was actually part of a wave of Democratic presidential candidates, from Gary Hart and Joe Biden to Dick Gephardt, John Glenn, Michael Dukakis, who all tried to capitalize on boomer nostalgia by presenting themselves as the new JFK. Only Clinton succeeded. But unlike Reagan, Clinton was connected to Kennedy stylistically, far more than substantively. The major exception may be Clinton's AmeriCorps, a domestic extension of JFK's Peace Corps. More liberal than John Kennedy on a host of issues, Bill Clinton also found out the rules about private life behavior had changed enormously in 30 years. George Bush 43. Bush was more like Reagan than his father, invoking John Kennedy a great deal to build bipartisan support for his tax cuts and aggressive foreign policy. But it's Bush's romance of Ted Kennedy that best links these royal families of American politics. We describe in detail how Bush began cultivating Ted just days into office with a White House film screening of the movie 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The result was the No Child Left Behind education law. That is when they first agreed to work on that law together. And they made it work and they got it passed, whether you like it or not. Barack Obama, of course, how it must have hurt Bill Clinton to have lost the top Kennedys, Ted and Caroline, as they endorsed Obama over Hillary in 2008, one of the critical moments in that extremely close Obama-Clinton nomination battle. Obama is the first president too young to remember the Kennedy presidency, but he named the Situation Room for JFK and recently appointed Caroline as ambassador to Japan. So in summary, let me show you an eye-catching chart that we include in the book. The number of public references to JFK by each of his 9 successors. Take a look. Clinton surpassed even LBJ, while Reagan has the JFK citation record for a Republican president. For this book, our team conducted the largest public opinion study ever conducted about a long-ago presidency. A poll of over 2,000 adult Americans divided into those old enough to remember JFK and those too young to recall him during their life. We also sponsored 6 focus groups of 15 to 20 people each in 3 cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Richmond, Virginia. For this endeavor, we hired 2 of the most accomplished pollsters in the nation, Peter Hart and Jeff Guerin of Hart Research, which co-conducts the regular NBC News Wall Street Journal surveys. Jeff Guerin will show you just a small sampling of what we have, and then I think you'll see why we entitled this section of the book, The People's President. Jeff, please come on up, and thank you so much for the great work you did for us.
Good morning, everybody. This was a fascinating project. We are used to talking to Americans about contemporary politicians. And in this research, it was even though we were talking about somebody who had passed a half-century ago, it was as if we were talking to Americans about a contemporary politician. That's the nature and the quality of the responses, the robustness, the personal feeling associated with them. As Larry said, we conducted focus group research. We did a very large-scale national survey. The interviews were conducted in June of 2012 in preparation for the book. We interviewed a total of 2,000 Americans, equally divided between those old enough to remember, have a living memory of President Kennedy, and people under the age of 55 who were too young at the time of his assassination to have any or not yet born, to have any real memory of his life or his death. Larry talked about November 22nd earlier as the day that changed America. And in this research, that's really what we heard from people. When we asked people about the impact of President Kennedy's assassination, 61%, and really in both generations across party lines, said that this really had a profound effect on the country. It changed America a lot. And when we asked people what was the biggest impact of President Kennedy's assassination, by far the overwhelming sense was it was the event that took away America's innocence, and that we continue to live with that legacy of a lost innocence today. If you could put up the charts here. One of the fascinating things we did here is we asked people about their opinions of President Kennedy, and indeed all of the presidents from the Eisenhower and beyond, and asked them about their favorability toward each one. As you can see here in terms of a mean rating, that is, we asked people to rate their sense of the quality of each president on a scale of 0 to 10. JFK has the highest mean rating of any president. And what is fascinating about the results for President Kennedy is that he has the highest rating from voters of the opposite party of any president in the last 50 years. So if you look at Democrats rating Republican presidents or Republicans rating Democratic presidents, President Kennedy has the best ratings across party lines. Indeed, his rating among Republicans is mean rating is 6.7, higher than many presidents receive across the electorate. Pardon my coughing. The other fascinating thing about President Kennedy on this chart is the extent to which people know about him. Looking at the generation under the age of 55, people under the age of 55, 54% of them said they know a great deal about a great deal or fair amount about President Kennedy. Compare that to 50% who say they know that much about George Washington, or 57% who know that much about Abraham Lincoln, or 33% who know that much about FDR. He really stands out among the great presidents as somebody who people know. And if you look at the presidents who served just before and just after JFK, as I said, 54% of people under the age of 55 feel they have a real good working knowledge of JFK, but only 17% feel that way about LBJ, the president who came right after him, and only 20% about President Eisenhower, the president who served right before him. So it's really qualitatively and quantitatively different. On this next chart, Larry talked about how Americans think today about the assassination and the Warren Commission report. And what we find very clearly, and again, there's no difference by generation really or across party lines, is that there are still, despite the fact that this is the most investigated murder in the history of America, most Americans, 3/4, believe that there are just still too many questions surrounding Kennedy's assassination to say that Lee Harvey Oswald acted by himself, or that there was not a larger conspiracy. So for many Americans, people think that this is very much of an open question. A few other interesting notes here on the next chart. We asked people about the fact that Americans today, of course, are aware of President Kennedy's personal shortcomings and his in terms of his conduct. But we asked them about the fact that it was not known back then that there was a so-called gentleman's agreement with the press that not to cover those kinds of private details of an elected official's personal life. And we asked people, is it better that way or better this way? And the way what we do today is that where everything is known. And we learned by 59 to 41, Americans said it was better off the other way, when the press did not report every detail of a president's personal life. This one does not quite cross party lines. Republicans are more evenly divided, but there is it does cross generations, with the sense that we don't really need to know all of these intimate personal details. Finally, I want to mention one other thing that's kind of apropos of the moment. We did a lot of really interesting things in this survey. We showed people videos because we did some of the research online. We were able to show people videos of different videos of President Kennedy, get their reaction, understand their memory of it. We had people listen to various quotations of President Kennedy, all of the most famous ones. But we asked people which of all the different quotes we read them about President Kennedy, which represents an attitude that we most need in America today. And given where we are in the country today, let me just close by reading you the quote that in June of 1912, most Americans said we most need back in our country today. It is a quote in which President Kennedy said, "Let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Let us not seek to fix blame for the past. Let us accept our own responsibility for the future." Of all of the things that we read to voters about President Kennedy in his own words, that's the one that stood out most to Americans about an attitude and a viewpoint that we need restored in America today. So with that, Larry? Yep.
Jeff, thank you, and Peter again, and your whole team. They were highly professional and a lot of fun to work with. We did have fun on this project, and I think this piece especially. I liked one of the conclusions after we had done all the focus groups and the poll. We found that John Kennedy is still a vivid presence, almost a contemporary figure, and that's why he translates so well into the 21st century. Many former presidents don't, and it's one reason why they're not as well remembered. And I think many of you have gotten the full poll. We've got a whole chapter on the poll here, and then we're going to post the entire poll with every single finding on the Kennedy Half-Century website. So it will be available and for everybody's use coming up. As we finish, I wanted you to see our book's global map of 1,300 monuments. I know you can make out all those dots, right? These are the schools, the hospitals, the sports arenas, the mountains, the forests, the gardens, already named for John F. Kennedy. It's a very partial list. We don't pretend to have found all of them. And the total is being added to almost daily in this season of solemn remembrance. Even an incomplete accounting like this is impressive, and it suggests the scope of Kennedy's impact over the last half-century and the sorrow with which people did greet and still greet the assassination. I'll conclude this gathering as I concluded the book. In just a few decades, there will be left no one alive with a personal memory of the Kennedy administration or its tragic end. Perhaps time and distance will finally enable the country to put JFK's legacy into full perspective. What lasts will be what matters, not just the stark reminder that even the most charmed life can be defined by brutal tragedy, but genuine inspiration from John Fitzgerald Kennedy's words and deeds, the things that moved history and people's minds and hearts. And that is also the end of this rollout of the Kennedy Half-Century. Thank you all very much for coming.